We're going to do how to remove Sharpie from leather. Leather that gets used day to day gets exposed to so many different types of substances. Even just from daily wear and tear, it can come into contact with dirt, grime, dust, and sometimes the Sharpie. So Sharpie markers and related type pens are going to have a few special ways to clean them up. So we're going to look at the nature of Sharpie ink on leather. We're going to look at different leather types, and then we're going to walk you step by step through cleaning each of those leather types so that you can get your Sharpie out of your leather. First, we're going to explore the nature of the ink on leather. So typically, we have our marker to write on paper, and it's going to transfer the pigment from the tip of that Sharpie pen or permanent marker into the fibers of that paper. And what's interesting is that leather is also comprised of fibers. And so when pigment gets on the top of that, it's usually going to get drawn into those fibers. So when that same Sharpie ink comes into contact with leather, those fibers are going to drink that ink in and pull it down. So what's really happening is that we are essentially applying a dye, just like we would if we were to dye leather or stain leather intentionally to change its color. We're doing pretty much exactly that with the Sharpie, but we're doing that in a very specific area and a very specific color. So it's essentially the same. So when we look at how we're going to be treating a Sharpie stain on our leather, the question is how do we address a very specifically dyed part of our leather in a very particular color? So whereas paints, they're more on the surface, Sharpie is actually getting deep in there into the fibers. And it's going to be impacted too by whether it is a alcohol-based ink, like Sharpies are, or if we come across something like an oil-based, which is typical pens. And that matters too, because guess what is in natural leather? Fats, oils, and waxes, and all kinds of things like that. So if we're adding in, new oils, for example, that's going to blend and mix with all the ones that are in there. And if we're adding in new alcohol-based dyes, that may blend and move as well. So it's important to remember too that an ink stain may actually have some traveling movement within those leather fibers. Just something to keep in mind. So now let's look at a few factors to consider when you've got a Sharpie stain. And the first there is the type of leather. For example, we may have a faux or synthetic leather. It could be plastic based and maybe even have a totally solid surface with no pores or holes in it. That can be one type. Another is a coated type of leather. And it essentially has a natural leather bottom part, but has a coating on top that could be there for aesthetics, protection, or even to add any kind of a texture or color. For example, this is a very popular type of leather used often in handbags and accessories. We then have our uncoated leather. This has all the pores exposed, and it's going to be pretty unique in its challenges, and we're going to certainly look more at that as well. So that would be the first thing. Figure out what type of leather you have. And that may happen by testing it out, or you may know, because potentially, before using the substances we are to clean it, you may be able to find a more gentle one. We're going to use primarily rubbing alcohol and acetone. So if there's a way to not use them because of your leather type that allows it, that would be great. A second option is to consider how recently that ink has been applied. If it's still new, you may want to use something like a cornstarch. And this is going to be a powdered substance that gets applied to the top of your leather. And especially for vegetable tanned unprotected leathers, that may start to draw out that ink over time. It is a slow process. It could take days and multiple applications to do, and your results may or may not vary. Additionally, during that same time, this ink inside the fibers may start traveling, and it may move a little bit from where it originally was. So it's up to you whether that time may be worth the benefit. So our next options are usually going to be rubbing alcohol and acetone. And here's the biggest key, especially when you're working with a natural leather. So this Sharpie stain is essentially a dyed piece of leather, just in that pattern. So when we remove that colorant, that dye, there's also the original color of the leather and the tanning agents that were used. The acetone and rubbing alcohol are not going to know the difference between the Sharpie marker and all of the coloring around it. So it's likely that it's going to remove that Sharpie. It can also remove all the other color on your leather. So keep that in mind. And once those solvents evaporate, you may have another stain where they were. So now we've traded one stain. So now we've essentially traded one stain for another. That still might be a benefit depending on what you're trying to do, though it's important to keep that in mind before going into it. All right, enough jibber jabber. Let's get to the action. So here we're going to clean these 3 samples and show you exactly the differences in terms of the cleaning product and the result. So first up, we're going to have our synthetic leather. I'll put down some foil here to protect our work surface. And then we'll take our Sharpie. And we're going to mark it up. All right. So there we have our Sharpie marked leather. And the first thing we want to do is try our weaker of the 2 solvents. That's going to be our rubbing alcohol. And in terms of applying it, we have a few options. One is going to be a cotton lint-free cloth. This is going to be great because it's going to be soft and not scratch your leather, but it's also going to be absorbent enough to hold some of that rubbing alcohol and also give you a large enough surface area to kind of do some work. Another option for more focused areas are going to be a Q-tip. It'll have a soft cotton tip, and when the alcohol is put on it, it should kind of mat that down, so you're not going to get much lint transfer. Another option you may have, though it's not recommended, is going to be a cotton round. These are used often for cosmetic application or cleaning, and they can work, but sometimes some lint and fuzziness comes off of it. So in a pinch, they can be helpful, though if you have it, generally a cotton rag will be best. So first thing we'll do is we will open up our rubbing alcohol. We'll put a little bit on our rag like this. And then we're just going to let it sit on the leather. Where possible for most stains, dabbing is going to be better than rubbing, because if you are going to rub it, it may spread it. So here we already see that kind of coming off, right? So now let's see if we were to rub a little bit what's happening. So it's interesting. It's kind of taking some of the pigment off, but if you see, it's still there. So let's just do one more pass in here. And keep in mind too, if you're going to use the same rag, move the surface that's going to touch your leather, because we don't want to rub that ink all around into it even more. We want to remove it. So you could either rearrange your cotton rag or have a couple that you've got around and then just use a few of them while you're cleaning. So here, not working as great. It's working slowly. So maybe if you take your time and do a lot, that can work. Though in general, let's try next our acetone. So acetone is usually going to work well on, let's try this. So I'm going to get another cotton cloth. Now we'll just open our acetone and put a little bit on it. All right, we've got that. Now let's let it rest. Now we'll start to rub it off. Aha! You can probably see we're getting some better results already. So we're already getting it more off there. So what I recommend next is taking a Q-tip, because that's going to allow us to now put a concentrated amount in a very specific place. So we'll take that Q-tip, kind of dip it in, and then here, close up our bottle. And then here we'll take this Q-tip and rest it in those areas. And really get that acetone concentrated there. And you can kind of do that several times slowly. And what I'm going to do now is just put more on the larger rag, and then for expedience sake, just kind of rub it a lot. Though I recommend dabbing and giving it time, I just want to show you what is possible in a short period of time here. All right, so you clearly want to go, slow and take your time. Though in the sense of a demonstration, we put our acetone on, and here is our result. Pretty clean. I don't see much of that original Sharpie. There is a little bit, and so again, if we take our time and kind of do more applications, we should be in better shape. But overall, that works. All right, so that's our synthetic leather. Now let's look at our coated leather. So if we see here, it's coated. And you could probably notice a difference already. I'm going to talk more about that in a second. But right here, we're going to put some Sharpie there. Oh man, here we go. Get a nice area covered. So there we've got our Sharpie on our leather. So first thing we'll do is we will get our rubbing alcohol and a white cloth, our cotton cloth, kind of get some on there, and then we're going to simply let it sit and then rub that off. And we could see that ink is coming out, and we could see it on our rag, and that's where if you have multiple passes, it's going to be good, especially with clean rags, so you're not getting that ink all over other stuff. And that could also be another good opportunity here for using our Q-tip, so you could really get in these ridges and kind of get those little residual bits of ink out. And that'll evaporate. So that's gone. And that worked only with the rubbing alcohol. However, you probably notice what I do. This looks like it's a little bit darker here. But wait, the ink is gone. And it is. Though what's happening is this alcohol is also removing this protective surface layer, which has the white pigment. So we're seeing more of that gray leather below it. So that's something to keep in mind, and also why we test, because if that solvent is removing the ink, it may also be removing the surface of the leather that we've got. So if we take this example, I'm just going to go get even more of that alcohol and just kind of rub this even more. We can now see we're kind of rubbing that surface layer off, more and more all around as we go. So that's part of the pros and cons. So keep in mind that some things may actually help get that ink out, but then may also damage the leather. So it's going to be important to figure out, what's going to be the best balance for you. So that is our protected leather. And next we're going to have our unprotected leather. This is going to be a vegetable tan leather with the pores that are open. So we're going to go through a few different things that you may want to try, and we'll explore each one. So first and foremost is going to be our isopropyl alcohol, rubbing alcohol. We're going to get it on our Q-tip because especially in vegetable tan leather, anything that happens around these fibers may get absorbed into the ones around it. But first I'm going to put a line right here of just the rubbing alcohol, and then I'm going to start up here. And again, I mentioned usually you want to dab, but for the expediency of this demonstration, I'm going to rub just to show you kind of what happens. So we're starting to see some of that Sharpie come off on the Q-tip, and we're also seeing what's happening on the end there. Along with this, I'm going to try a similar example using a Q-tip and our acetone. So if we look here, we have our acetone. I'm going to do an acetone line on the right. And then I'm going to try it right down here. We're going to kind of rub this. And again, you'd always dab, not rub, but I want to do this to show you in a quickly related fashion what's happening. And so there we've got that. You can see a little more ink is coming out with the acetone and the rubbing alcohol. Though if we look, two things are happening. With the rubbing alcohol, it's actually changing that color of the leather, even just the alcohol on the surface. And with our acetone, it's changing it a little bit as well, but differently. And then if we look here, most of this is going to be, dry. It's discoloring the leather. Even the acetone, we're seeing a stain form around that as it's drying, and there's still a lot of Sharpie left. The acetone is removing a little more of it, but it's still there. So that's why it gets really tricky, because imagine if you wanted to dye your leather, red, and you put red dye on this half of the piece. That red dye is going to go into those fibers and kind of penetrate into them down, just like that ink is doing. And so it's not going to be as easy as just changing the surface, because that ink is in there now. So that gives us a few things to consider. And one more is going to be the magic eraser. And the magic eraser functions mostly like a very fine sandpaper. So if we think about our pros and cons of removing this, this may be an okay trade-off. So let's try it out. We have our water. We're going to dip it in to get it wet. Then we're going to wring it out as much as we can in here. All right, cool. Now we have our eraser. So now let's go to the middle of this line. We're going to do some magic erasering and see what happens. All right, so we can see there, and once it dries, which will take a little while, so we could see here, some of that Sharpie is already gone where we use the magic eraser. And the magic eraser, you usually want to use it wet. That's assuming a hard surface. Since this is already a porous surface, you may want to start out trying it dry, or maybe even using a very fine sandpaper. Because what that's going to do, it's going to remove part of the surface of that leather, and that may make that mark a little less noticeable. Now, as we talked about, the Sharpie doesn't sit on the surface, it kind of seeps in with the pigments. And so even if you get that surface changed, there's still going to be color below it. So in this approach, you may get a little bit of a less pronounced stain, but it may not totally remove it. For that, it's possible you may need to essentially recolor that leather. Because that Sharpie marker is as if we have dyed that leather, we may then have to change the entire dye of that leather surface to match each other. So there are a lot of variables that go into an unprotected leather, how it looks, where it's used, the pros cons of altering it, altering part of it, altering all of it. So it's really going to be heavily context dependent. So let's put all this into a few key thoughts. One is that Sharpie on leather can be removed depending on what type of leather it is. There are literally thousands of combinations out there, so that's where testing in a small area is going to be your best bet to start. Along with that, safety is always key. So before using any solvents or any kind of cleaners, do your research and find out if and how it's going to be a good approach for you, so that whatever is done with safety. Along with that, and probably the best, is that there's no one answer for everything. It's very context dependent, and that gives you the ability to assess what's going on and then make a choice that you feel works best for you. And in most cases, there's going to be a great way to get that Sharpie out of the leather. And there you have it. Until next time.